All right, guys, can everybody hear us now? How are we doing? We're good. Just waiting on the chat. It's a bit of a delay on stream here. Yes. Okay. Here we go. We're good. Hey everybody, welcome to Fleet Week, the Stellar Service. This panel is something I'm very, very excited about as a science fiction fan, a Star Trek fan, a fan of military history and military science. These things all overlap quite a bit, in fact. And I am here with a panel of experts that I can't wait to introduce to all of you. And so I'm just going to pass it around the horn. But first, I guess I'll introduce myself. I am Thomas Maroney, Associate Art Director for Star Trek Online. And I had the pleasure and privilege of modeling the USS Enterprise NCC 1701F, which will soon be in Star Trek Picard. And so that's really tremendous, and we're all really excited about that here. But we're not talking about that quite yet. We're going to do this Stellar Service panel tonight, and we're going to be talking about Star Trek, Starfleet, world building and science fiction. It's going to be awesome. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to my panelists, starting with the lovely Presbys. Andy and Joel, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'll go. You first. I'm Andy Presby. I guess my claim to fame is I'm a 22-year U.S. Navy submarine veteran who now works in the space industry. I build primitive fission-powered impulse engines, and it's all because of Star Trek. Also, I married her, which is the other smart decision I made.
And you guys have I think you have a really cute meetup story, like how you all met. So I think we might have a bit of a distraction in talking about that in a little bit. But what about you, Joel?
All right, so I am a science fiction author. I've got a book coming out in November. But I was born in France. You know, we've got great Star Trek captains born various places, and I didn't get to be born in Iowa, but I was at least born in France. I'm a Navy nuclear power engineering officer veteran, and I managed to get this guy to marry me, and life's pretty good.
That was easy.
And you're a science fiction author now, right? Can you just tell us the name of your latest book really quick?
My book coming out in November is called The Dabere Snake Launcher.
Nice.
It's near-term science fiction. If you wanted to imagine one of the ways we might get to a world where we could actually have Star Trek ships, this is one possible way.
Awesome. All right, great. Thanks so much. So now we'll pass it down to Chris.
Hello, I'm Chris Weave. I'm a war gamer, professional war gamer and naval analyst. I often say that my fandom superpowers, I can talk about real-world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. And my hobbies are naval history, science fiction, especially space combat, and not speaking for my employer.
Awesome. And what about you, Pat?
Hi, so my name's Pat Doyle. I am I'm a current Navy Reserve officer. I also try to have some expertise in not speaking for any of my employers that I'll mention. I'm also an airline captain and a simulator instructor. So I get to put new airline pilots and old airline pilots through the Kobayashi Maru scenarios with wind shear and all that kind of stuff. Only the goal in this case is there is a correct solution.
It's not a test of character.
No, there is a correct solution, and nobody cares about your character during this.
Oh, no.
And then I'm a war gamer. I've played the various Star Trek and Starship combat games over the years, and have recently designed my own called Star Force Commander.
Nice, awesome. Well, and we were gonna while we're going through and introducing everybody, we also wanted to really quick hit on what your favorite ship from Star Trek is. So mine is the really the original Enterprise from the original series. I actually got to see the model in person at the Smithsonian a few years back, and I had pretty much had a religious experience after they restored it for the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, and it was pretty incredible to see it. And they actually every 15 minutes they actually lit up, and the the buster collectors rotated and spun, and the windows all lit up and everything. It was beautiful. So that's my favorite Star Trek ship. What we'll do is just have that keyed up in your brain, and then when you say something, you can shout it off. But I do want to introduce for everybody watching how I met all these fine people. Is we actually met through a science fiction novel series called Honor Harrington, which is a military science fiction series. And the organization that brought us together was called Bu9, and we won't go into why it was called that or whatever. But essentially, the idea was to gather a group of experts from a variety of different fields who would all bring their expertise to the world building, and kind of the author would consult with us and say, hey, if I want to do X, how accurate is that to how the Navy would do it, or how scientifically accurate is it, or whatever. And so one of the things I thought would be interesting for us to talk about is kind of the relationship between science fiction and world building, and how important world building is to science fiction, and what some of the examples of maybe where Star Trek does it well, and some examples where it does it poorly. So I'm actually going to start with Joelle on that, because as a science fiction author, you actually have to do this in the books that you write.
Well, gosh. Yeah.
Start with space level research. She had to do a lot of research for the book she just showed you.
So yeah. Sometimes there's actual research that's already been done by scientists, and so you can take what the scientists have said about something, like how to build a space elevator, and then turn that into the background for a story. And sometimes you have to invent something, like some wormholes that are stable enough to travel through, and other more fantasy and less sciencey kind of world building backgrounds.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about world building, for people who maybe haven't heard that term too much, we're talking essentially about the fictional history of the world that your story takes place in, right? And the things that happen that have consequences that then chain together to create the circumstances in which the story takes place. And so, Chris, I remember you told me a story that I think is a good example of this in the real world, where we were on you were given one of the things I love to do with these people, the Bu9 folks, is go on tours of real Navy ships, because they all have great stories about what everything is and does. And so there was a particular object that you pointed out and said, oh, that's a Belknap pole, right? And can you explain what that was? Because I thought it was really funny.
Yeah, we were pierside in Norfolk. I can't remember exactly which carrier we were looking at, because there's a couple of different options there, and we were looking at aircraft carriers along the piers. And the Belknap pole is a pole that's forward of the island structure on an aircraft carrier on the starboard side. And the idea is that you raise this pole when you're not conducting flight ops, and it has a light on the top. And the purpose of that light is so that other ships at night have a reference point. And it's called a Belknap pole because the USS Belknap lost the bubble on exactly how the John F. Kennedy was oriented. And by the time they figured it out, they could not prevent the collision from happening.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, it was bad. It was bad. The ship caught on fire because they basically ripped a hole in one of the fuel tanks, and they dumped, thousands of gallons of aviation fuel down the stack of the Belknap. and it was a pretty bad fire. They managed to melt the superstructure of the Belknap down. Several sailors were killed. A friend of mine that I used to work with was actually on the ship at the time it happened. In fact, he was in combat, and the one side of combat was ripped off. And it was quite a serious accident. And anytime the Navy has an accident like that, there's an accident report, and they figure out exactly what happened and what were the contributing factors, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the contributing factors was that they had sort of lost the orientation of the ship. And so the idea was give them 2 reference points. And so you know that if you're seeing the front light to the left and the rear light to the right, you're on the port side. If it's the other way around, you're on the starboard side, and you've got a much better idea of how they're going. It's important to understand that Navy ships, and so the funny thing is that I'm the guy who's telling the story about the Navy ships, whereas my 3 colleagues have all, two of them are experienced, qualified ship drivers. And my guess is Pat's done a little bit of that in his ROTC days. Whereas I was offered the opportunity to drive, and I said, I don't think my license covers this class of vehicle. But the same is true of starships. Would be true of starships also, in that it's not like driving your car. It's not like driving your bicycle. These are things that have a lot of mass. They're hard to stop. They're hard to turn, and you need to think everything through. In World War II, when the USS Washington, I think it was, collided with, I believe, the USS Indiana, they sounded the collision alarm a full minute before the 2 ships touched. They had a minute to prevent that collision, and they could not, because the ships just aren't that maneuverable.
Yeah.
So maintaining your situational awareness on the orientation of the ship and what speed it's moving and all those other things is critical to not have a bump.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. I mean, that's a crazy, it's obviously a tragic story, but it's one of those things when you learn about it, and there are a million other examples like that when you're on a ship of things that were essentially like something went wrong and they learned about it and they learned how to prevent that thing from going wrong next time, right? And if you're writing science fiction, or if you're a fan of science fiction, and you're building a world of your life on board a starship, it's fun to like think about those kinds of things. What could go wrong and what would they do to prevent it? And that's not something they do on Star Trek very much. It seems like the Enterprise is usually the one discovering all the ways that things can go wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Thomas, I want to piggyback on what Chris had to say to explain a little bit more about, so when you're driving a surface ship at night, you don't have all the gorgeous little lights that you have on any Star Trek ship that makes it beautiful and clearly shown against a background of the stars. You have people choosing where the lights go on a Navy warship because they want them to look boring, so that it looks as much like as just a regular commercial carrier ship as anything else. Oh, and wow. So that's why it can be hard for the other ships, who are also trained and in theory capable, warship being driven by professionals, to sometimes make mistakes. And when they get close, there's an aspect to being on an ocean as opposed to being in space, that when you get close enough, because you are close, the ocean moves out of the way and you get sucked together.
Oh, so wow. Okay.
It can be impossible to not collide after you've gotten just a little bit too close. And if Pat wants to take this away, he can explain it even better, because some of those forces are the same for pilots.
Yeah, 2 ships that want to pass in the night frequently go bump in the night.
Well, my only experience with ship driving was on a sailboat at night in near Norfolk, Virginia, where we actually lost power on the sailboat, which means we didn't even have a light. And this is
Oh,
an area
no.
with big barges and stuff
Oh
like
my
that
gosh.
going through.
Were you off San
And-
Diego in 2001?
What's that?
No, but I had to avoid somebody like that.
Yeah, and I do remember that a barge came by and we didn't see it till it was real close and had to do the whole hard over thing and all that kind of stuff because it gets dark out there. So,
And if you guys
but-
want to know how the Romulans feel, try doing it when your height of eye is 3 feet above. When you're looking through a periscope, your height of eye is about 3 feet above the water, three to
Right,
6.
you're on a submarine, Andy, so you're as close as we get to cloak ships right now.
Yes, yeah, and they can't see you. Frequently, you can't see them,
Uh-huh.
but you can hear them. So I mean, it's very different from Trek, right?
Mhm.
The funniest story I have about ships have all these crazy lights, right? That mean something to other professionals. They're written into the rules of the road, the international regulations that govern what lights you put on your ships. Curiously enough,
What lights you're supposed to put on your ships.
she's not wrong. What lights you're supposed to put on your ships. Curiously enough, Starfleet running lights are the same. The green and the red light on the left and right sides of the ship, the port and starboard sides of the ship, are the same colors as on wet Navy ships.
Yeah.
But and this is so a buddy of mine had the watch for this, but the guy looks through the periscope and he's looking at it and he keeps coming back to the one place and he keeps looking and he goes and he tells the older person who was actually in charge of the watch, hey, what's a bunch of orange lights going left to right getting bigger and then a glowing orange light on top with a green and a red light? And the man in this case in charge of the ship, the officer of the deck, goes, I don't know. Whoa, emergency deep, which is the command you give to take the ship down. And then he turns to my friend and he says, yeah, so that's the left and right running lights of a speedboat with the tachyometer on the console of the speedboat getting illuminated as we run up behind it. And the intermittent orange light is the captain smoking. It was his cigarette.
Whoa, holy crap.
That's a lot of experience to have determined the cigarette thing.
No, he saw it before he put the phone.
Yeah. Wow.
Now, that didn't happen to me. I was not on watch for that. I wasn't on the boat where that happened. They could have just been messing with the new guy. But that's the kind of decision you're making in real time when you're doing this.
They mess with the new guy?
Never.
Hey, at least we saw some of that. We see some of that in Strange New Worlds.
In Strange New Worlds, they mess with the new guy.
The friendly hazing of the new person. That's good.
And on Discovery.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting to see the TNG. I think I had a conversation the other day talking about how, is Starfleet a military? Might as well sort of dive into that now because I think we've got that. That's a lot of ground to cover, right? But I think if you had asked Gene Roddenberry during the original series, is Starfleet military, he would have said yes. I think by the time you get to Next Generation, he probably would have said no, right? Mm. And then you have a bunch of other different creators and showrunners and writers who have, if you ask Nick Meyer, he would absolutely say yes, right? But then you get to Rick Berman, probably wouldn't care, and then and then nowadays, who knows? But Andy, I don't want to forget because I do want to share your story about the showing your submarine to Rick Berman and Herman Zimmerman. So we'll come back to that. But let's just sort of go around the horn and talk about that. As far as is Starfleet military? I mean, it really Starfleet is Starfleet, first of all, right? So it can be whatever it is. It doesn't have to necessarily fit into a label, but you are probably some of the most qualified people to talk about this in terms of what do you consider military and how do you feel that Starfleet relates to that, and what sort of lens do you look at Starfleet through as a giant bureaucracy that has a certain set of missions. So I'll start with Pat on this one.
So I think it serves. I think, military or not military, they don't really offer what it is. They say it's an exploratory organization, when they say it's not a military. But in the end, the defense of the Federation is a function that this organization provides. So I think whether you want to label it a military or not, I'm not sure. That's but they do provide the defense function, right? They patrol the borders. They make sure, well, unsuccessfully, because whatever strange thing seems to always go straight for Earth. And there's usually only ever one ship. So we can discuss their deployment abilities and stuff like that. But, they don't seem to be prepared for battle. When it happens, it takes them a while to adapt. And then they come back, as we saw in Deep Space Nine and stuff, because they're just not expecting it. But anyways,
But when they come back, they'll eat your face.
That's right. Because one thing that Starfleet is it's massively adaptable, right? They come up with a challenge, they get their butts kicked the first time out, and then they realize, oh, yeah, we got this simple little fix, send it out to everybody and do it. But so I think the fact that they provide the function of a military, you could probably say it's a piece of it, it's part of it. Like Chris and I have discussed, they kind of provide the functions of a Coast Guard. They make shipping safe, right? You can have these slow Warp 2, Warp 3 ships flying around in safety in Federation space because somewhere along the way there are starships protecting them from pirates and stuff. Hopefully, I'll stop now.
Does anybody want to go next, Joelle?
I agree with what Patrick said so far, and also I think if we say it is a military, the part of the United States military that it's most like is the Navy, if you also glom onto it the diplomat corps. Because it's really not the Marines or the Army or the Air Force or the Coast Guard. And I don't know enough about the Space Force to say how that culturally is. But there was a lot of the U.S. Navy historically that involved exploration, more currently that involves going into a little port somewhere that hasn't seen a lot of Americans, and the crew goes out and spends some money, and the officers go and visit the Chamber of Commerce and get all snazzy in our white uniforms and answer questions with mostly lies if they want to know specific details about how the ship works. Everything, every single piece of gear that you're not allowed to talk about has to do with us watching football, and it's all about getting good cable reception.
What's that antenna do? Football.
What about you, Chris? You got anything you wanted to add?
I have watched a NASCAR race in the wardroom of a U.S. cruiser.
That stuff works, man.
Yeah, it does. It does. We alternated between the race at Michigan and the fall of Baghdad, depending upon which course we were on. So my take on it is there is no real perfect analogy. I can't point to one service and say this is sort of what Starfleet's based on. I'm inclined to give the Coast Guard a little bit more credit than Joelle is. The Coast Guard traditionally always had 5 different missions. They were like fisheries enforcement, buoys and navigation, safety at sea, national defense, and law enforcement. And so that national defense was part of it, although it wasn't their primary job. But they do get activated in time of war and get given to the Navy for use during time of war. And so the Coasties are always an interesting bunch. I've worked with a few of them over the years, and they, on the one hand, they view themselves as part of the military, but on the other hand, everybody else kind of looks at them and goes, "Tell me again about the fisheries enforcement."
Oh no.
Right, and the pollution stuff and things like that, and so they're a little bit different. I do a talk frequently at science fiction conventions called "What the U.S. Navy Taught Me About Starfleet," and my conclusion there is that if you take the Coast Guard, you add some of the capabilities, some of the size, some of the budget, some of the prestige of the U.S. Navy to it, and then you also throw on the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Geographic Society, and the U.S. Department of State, you're kind of in the ballpark. But we get mixed signals from the various TV shows over what they think it is. If you go back and you look at, TOS really made it sound like they were the military.
Mm-hmm.
They call it a heavy cruiser, et cetera, et cetera.
And Kirk even said that he was a soldier in one of the episodes.
Yeah. Now, it is always important to remember who he's saying that to at the time, right?
Sure.
This is one of the things that you always have to say, as Picard especially. Picard will get up there and say, we've outgrown all of that. We do X, we do Y, we do Z. And every single instance where he says something like that, he's basically wearing his, I'm an ambassador of the Federation.
Right.
Very true.
So,
he's telling him this antenna is for football.
If you remember in Enterprise, though, when they put the Makos on board, it's like Lieutenant Commander such and such is complaining about the military being on his ship.
Yeah.
Huh. Lieutenant Commander, tell me again about the
lieutenant.
lieutenant.
He was the armory officer.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
I think it was
Yeah.
Malcolm.
Yeah, it
Who
was.
loves torpedoes and came from a lineage of the Royal Navy and stuff.
Right.
And let's be honest, had a torpedo room full of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Now it is important you could look at that particular instance and say, okay, they're going back to a definition that 100 years ago every American would have understood, and that today no American understands, which is that military specifically refers to the Army, and so you have military on the one hand and naval on the other, right? It's not the U.S. Army Academy at West Point; it's the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and you had a Naval Academy at the same time.
Right,
You
and
had
that's we were in the
interesting.
Navy. We navigate. If you're in the military or the militia, you militate. It means to march.
Interesting.
It literally means to march.
Oh, okay. I'm learning. I had no idea. That's interesting.
And so I actually think that a part of what's going on,
Marching at sea is called trapping.
it may very well be that a part of what's going on is in that Enterprise episode is that you've got Starfleet, which is really very much of a multinational organization, and that the ground pounder types are a much differently structured, differently oriented kind of. It's sort of like regular beat cops saying, why on earth is SWAT here?
Yeah.
SWAT isn't going to help this problem. This is a community policing problem. Why do we have the guys in the tactical gear here?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to riff off that because I sometimes go back and see. This is my favorite question in Star Trek, right? I just keep coming back to it because I love Starfleet.
I think it's the most important question about the show, about the franchise, is what is the nature of Starfleet?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot we can. I just have had great thoughts just thinking about this one question over the years. But I mean, the only reason I didn't return Starfleet, or I didn't join Starfleet, is the recruiter failed consistently to return my phone calls. I would have been in Starfleet in a minute. And with respect to Chris's point, I think sometimes when I saw that in Enterprise, I'm thinking to myself, you can't take over a planet with a starship generally. If you're out there to conquer territory, my Army and Marine Corps buddies love to remind me about this, and I think they're right. If you want to take territory from somebody, you need what they often call boots on the ground. You need people who are willing to carry guns and scare people and threaten people and sometimes hurt people. And sometimes in Trek, I think I see the word military as, we don't come here with the capability to take over your planet. We're not going to drop 1,000 Marines and take over your world. We can protect your space lanes, and oh, by the way, we have enough firepower to wipe out all life on your planet. That's the part of it that makes me it's a little disingenuous or a little odd, but that's often the way I hear that. Mm-hmm. I have the benefit of going last, though, and I've heard all my wonderful friends' thoughts on this. to me, the U.S. Navy used to have a poster which had a picture of an aircraft carrier in her glory driving at the camera, and an aircraft carrier weighs 100,000 tons. And the tagline of the poster was 100,000 tons of sovereign U.S. territory. And I think, in brief, Starfleet, like the Enterprise D, is 4.5 million metric tons of whatever the Federation needs there that week. Because the different places that the Federation government has to be are so far apart in time and space and communications lag that you need an officer or officers of the Federation government on scene, able to make decisions on behalf of the Federation, because in a lot of cases, you're not going to have time. So Starfleet, that's why we are having trouble defining it as just one thing, because it's kind of whatever they need that week.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool. And I also think that if you live in a Western country, because I know the U.S. military is kind of headed that way, and all the European militaries that I talk to are going this way too. We're kind of going there, right? I mean, submarines are sometimes used for research in the Arctic because no other platform can get there. Sometimes
And get back.
They can go.
You can do anything once.
But military ships are used for humanitarian relief and disaster relief and diplomacy and all these other things. That's happening now, but at a very low level. In Starfleet, they've just kind of gone, nope, we're going to build the biggest things we can. They're going to have all this capability. We're going to put the best people we can. And at any given day, it's like a Swiss Army knife. It's like a government Swiss Army knife.
So, Patrick, it looks like you wanted to...
Yeah, I was just going to say that, one, I think you also, it's worthwhile to discuss it in the different shows and the eras that we see presented as to how it's evolved. At the end of Star Trek or the beginning of Star Trek 6, that's clearly like a Joint Chiefs of Staff level meeting kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and they're talking about threats to the Federation. The period between Star Trek 6 and the beginning of the Next Generation, sometimes in beta canon, gets talked about this golden era where everything's fine and they're all out exploring and stuff like that. And they're not really, which would explain Picard saying, we're not a military in season 1 or 2 or something like that, because they haven't had anything to deal with for a long time. Then the Dominion comes along. Mm-hmm. Oh, go ahead. You want to?
It would also explain the carpets and the children.
And the children.
Starship.
Yeah, suddenly this is considered safe. But the other thing we also see now is, the original show, we see the people who are on the tip of the spear, people out exploring, deep space. But then in Lower Decks, we see that, no, there's people who follow behind them. Yeah. And we see a little bit of this in some other things, and we see it in Strange New Worlds, where they're dropping the subspace communication buoys, right? So they're, to the Coast Guard function that Chris talks about, they're maintaining these buoys there, because it appears that if you have those buoys and your communications range is longer and faster, is my impression. And then if you're away from this communications net, then it's 2 weeks before you get your message or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I know that's a writing technique to determine whether they have, but anyway, so yeah, I think there is multiple layers. You're going to have disaster relief, like we see some of the ships that have huge shuttle bays and containers. Well, because transporters don't work everywhere. That seems to be a very fragile system. So sometimes you need to do disaster relief in places and stuff.
And sometimes you rescue the colonists and you duplicate them.
I want to bring in Chris on this, because I think it's if we talk about comparing Starfleet to the U.S. Navy and the different missions, I think Starfleet is in the Enterprise specifically, in terms of operating on its own, it's kind of working on a model of the Navy from like the 19th century, right? Whereas the Navy nowadays is a very different animal in terms of how connected it is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The one of the comments that I frequently make is that the U.S. Navy has a pretty good idea of what the rest of the world looks like, right? There are no recorded instances of a carrier battle group going over the horizon and discovering a country that we had never heard of before, right? Stuff like that just doesn't happen. In addition to that, the U.S. Navy has a lot of reach back capability. The military in general, it's a big machine, and we may send out a carrier strike group, a carrier and a handful of ships, but they're in constant contact with folks back ashore who provide all sorts of support, intelligence, weather, logistics. The strike group does an unrep about twice a week. Airplanes are thirsty. They go through a lot of fuel. The U.S. Navy tries
What's an unrep really? Because I mean, people might not be familiar with that.
Underway replenishment. Unrep is replenishment at sea, I think, is the official term of art, but unrep is an older term that still gets used. And so if you've ever seen pictures of an oiler with a ship on either side of it, they've strung hoses between them in order to transfer fuel, and sometimes they'll have a high line and they're transferring boxes. Basically, they string a steel cable between the ships and run boxes across them. They also move stuff with helicopters too. It's a very complicated evolution, and it's one of those things that really sort of differentiates real navies from not real navies. If you can't do underway replenishment,
That's mean.
I think
it differentiates navies that can operate far from their coasts from navies that cannot.
From coastal defense navies, right?
Yeah, like I said, real navies from not real navies.
Some of those not real navies are our allies.
And they're very nice people.
And they are sending out their unrep ships for us. So
fair enough.
If they come alongside safely, they can still give us the oil.
And it is unrep us, then that counts. Then that counts. And that's actually that's an important point to understand, that for most of the world, the Navy is primarily more of a Coast Guard, and it has as much of a law enforcement, fisheries enforcement, that sort of stuff. We split it out, right? We've got the Coast Guard that is primarily focused on those things, and the U.S. Navy, at least in theory, is primarily focused on war fighting and diplomacy. The missions blend together, right? So we send U.S. Navy ships to do port calls, as Joelle was saying, but most other places don't split out their forces that way. And so, you go to a lot of parts of the world and you deal with the local Navy, and they're really kind of oriented more like a Coast Guard is. European, NATO allies are not quite that way. NATO allies have a tendency to some of them have a tendency to specialize, which is good because they generally specialize in stuff that we're not particularly good at, like mine warfare. So we have less capability at stuff like that than perhaps we would like, but that's why we have allies. Let's see, there was something else I was going to say about this, but I'm trying to remember where I was going with it.
Well, I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about the autonomy that somebody in Starfleet has versus the autonomy of a carrier commander has.
Yeah, so I mean, the admiral in charge of the carrier battle group is, they might go comm silent because they're under emissions control so that they can't be tracked. But as a general rule, there's a steady stream of two-way communication taking place between our forces at sea and the Home Office back in DC, or in Pearl Harbor, or wherever it is, whatever theater they're in. There's generally a lot of communication that takes place. There were times where Kirk was out there, and I remember in one of the episodes, I think it was Balance of Terror, where he says something to the effect of, it's going to be 2 weeks before we get a reply, just because it's going to take the radio that long. And that's funny. I especially like that episode because Kirk basically sends a message that says, I'm about to start a war. You guys okay with that? And the answer comes back later like, yeah, if you think you need to do that, go right ahead and do it. By that point, he had already solved the problem. But, in the old days, when by that I mean like Age of Sail, or even later than that, when a ship disappeared all over the horizon and you could no longer run up flags or signal lights or something like that, it was gone. There was a time period where, before radio but after cables, where if it went to a foreign port, a message might catch up with it. But if you go back to like the time of the Royal Navy, when the Royal Navy was a global force, they would have orders that said, go here and come back in a year.
Do what you think best. Good luck.
Do what you think best. And basically, captains were given a huge amount of discretion, because you could never predict. It's not like you can just do this big if-then nested tree decision-making tree. It was, this is what we're trying to accomplish. These are the things that are important that you should keep in mind. We want you to go to this place and do this thing. But, if something else comes up, go do whatever. Just remember, when you get back, we're going to talk about it.
I think the best phrase that comes from the airline world that exemplifies that is, good luck, we're all counting on you.
And I do want to make
Leslie
one point,
Niels.
though.
Yeah.
Just because it figured prominently in my own life, which is I explicitly picked the submarine force because the submarine force was at that time not really like Chris is describing, in the sense that you're not in continuous communications when you're on a submarine. You can be, but typically when I joined, you were not. I can't speak to current operations, but it was very much more, go to this patch of ocean, do this list of things. If you see anything bad, call us. Otherwise, stay undetected. And so it was much more of a Star Trekian, it was more of a Kirkian kind of feel to operations. So
Possibly even Romulan.
Possibly Romulan. But I don't like to think of it that way. The Navy never asked me to do anything illegal. That I can say.
In the surface Navy, there was I realize I am biased because I served on a destroyer also, but there is a sense that the best job you would ever have, even if somehow you made it all the way to 4-star admiral, was to command a destroyer on independent ops. So if you were able to, you did an awesome job on your 2 department head tours, and so you got to have pretty much your pick of where to go. What you wanted to do was use all your networking tools to figure out which destroyers were not going to be assigned a carrier battle group during your tour, and get one of those. So you could have one of those. All right, you're going on a 6-month deployment, but you're under emissions control, and we expect you to arrange to meet up with your replenishment at sea ships every 10 days or so, or whatever it needs to be. But otherwise, go do your things.
But Chris is certainly right. Nothing with the capability or size of an aircraft carrier just goes away and doesn't talk to the president for 9 months.
Yeah.
I just want to, if your viewers are interested in it, there are pieces of the real world Navy that are still, like Chris was describing, a little bit.
Yeah. Speaking about decision trees, I actually wanted to bring in an example from Star Trek DS9, because I remember hearing you talk about this one time, Andy, about Worf. I can't forget the exact name of the episode, but Worf is commanding the Defiant, and the ship.
It's rules of engagement.
Yeah, and I'll let you can explain what happened, but you use that as a contrasting example of how the U.S. Navy is different than Starfleet, which I thought was really fascinating.
Okay, so this is the rules of engagement. This is rules of engagement. It's I forget which season and which episode. One of your viewers is going to look it up on Memory Alpha as I'm talking.
It's probably 6 or 7, but
I think it's 6 or 7, because Worf has the Defiant. Well, 1, we've got Worf, and 2, Worf has the Defiant. And it's, if anybody knows military history, it's a take on the Vincennes incident, and I think it was written by Ron Moore. And it might be my favorite Trek episode of all time, just because it captures in the canon for me the best difference between how you do things in the modern Navy and how you do things in Starfleet. So the story is, like, Worf's out there in the Defiant, and they're in a convoy, and I think they get attacked, and a Klingon freighter decloaks out of nowhere right in front of the Defiant on a collision course, and Worf orders it destroyed. And the whole episode is about Worf's court-martial. And there's a B-plot with Odo going to Kronos and gathering all the evidence. Worf gets acquitted. The Duras, I think it was the Duras sisters were still alive at that point. So the Duras sisters were trying to frame him. There was nobody on the Klingon freighter that decloaked in front of them. And it was all a plant to dishonor Worf somehow. And Worf gets acquitted, and they have the rah-rah party. And if it was an episode of TOS, you would have expected do-do-do-do-do-do-do, you know, that music at the end, because Sisko walks into Worf's stateroom, and Worf's being a gruff Klingon, and he doesn't want to go to the party because he doesn't like parties. And but because he failed, because he knows he screwed up. And Sisko got him off, but Worf knows he screwed up. And Sisko was his trial lawyer. He defended him as trial. And Sisko says, "You're darn right you did. You screwed up. If we were," and I'm paraphrasing, if we were a regular military organization in a war, yeah, you're right. You shoot, you know, if your ship is under threat, you shoot. You kill the target to protect your crew. We're Starfleet. We die, we take the hit, and we die to prevent the possibility of a war. That was basically Sisko's kind of message, at least as I remember. It's been a little while since I've seen the episode. Chris and Pat have seen it more recently. Chris points out that it's not as good an example as I thought it was originally, but I think the essence of the idea, though, still holds, in the sense that that Sisko was basically saying, I think something that was really more applicable to a first contact kind of combat scenario, not with a bunch of Klingons, but during the middle of a declared war, because they were, I think, in the middle of a declared war. But the basic idea holds, and it's the place where I first started really thinking about, and I think Ron Moore and the people at DS9 really drove it home about, okay, let's start thinking about how Starfleet does things, maybe better than a military, maybe not, but at least differently. And I'll just, and I'm sure Chris has some points to talk about this, but my get off the stage point on this is, I mean, imagine what kind of society it would take to take your highest technology, your most capable ships. Those ships can't be easy to build. And then like the best of the best of the best, and then send them bravely into the unknown with orders to die instead of starting a war. That's the part that's always stuck with me. And I think regardless of the episode's other dramatic issues, that's the part that makes me go, ooh, Starfleet's interesting. That's a highfalutin society.
Yeah, I believe he said, if in that case we lose the battle, right? We're willing to lose the battle also, I thought, which is not typically something you're encouraged to do in the military.
Well, Chris,
you had case I would like to point out. This is the one case where I could say that Starfleet is like the Marine Corps, expecting somebody to jump on top of a grenade. That's just something you do.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
The talk at the end of that episode is fantastic.
Yes, but the situation doesn't.
Yeah, the talk at the end is fantastic. You know, Sisko going in, because you left out what I think is one of the best parts about that is Sisko goes in and says, you need to go to this party because they're all down there to celebrate you getting off. And he says, I don't feel like celebrating because I screwed up. You know, this really was my fault. And they go through and they have that conversation. And I'm going to get to talking about that in just a second. But then Sisko says, this isn't for you, asshole. This is for them. They stayed behind you. So put a damn smile on your face and go down there. This is one of the, and he specifically says, you know, you put on that rank and you're at a level now where this isn't that you need to stop thinking about you and you need to start thinking about your people. They're there and they're wondering where you are, and you need to go down and put a smile on your face because it's part of your job description.
And that's great management advice, whether you manage a Federation starship, a nuclear attack submarine, or a McDonald's. It doesn't matter. People need to see the people in charge, and they need to know that they care about them.
Sorry, Chris, you finish. I'll
No, I was going to say the place where I have a real problem with that episode is that basically they leave out the part that just drives me crazy is that essentially that entire bit with the ship decloaking takes place during a battle.
Yeah.
Right? It would be one thing if it was just a threatening environment, but it was actually, there had been an exchange of fire, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, there were birds of prey engaged. Fine.
They tried to set it up like it was the Vincennes incident, where the USS Vincennes shot down an airliner in the Gulf, an Iranian airliner in the Gulf. But it wasn't applicable at all. Worf wasn't being quick on the trigger. What it was is there had been an attack against the convoy he was protecting, and all of a sudden an enemy ship decloaks in front of him. I'd take that shot in a heartbeat. And I wouldn't be apologetic about it because it was in the middle of a battle. If it hadn't been in the middle of the battle, okay then.
You know, Vincennes was in combat at the time, though, right?
No.
Vincennes,
wasn't it?
We don't want to get off on this.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Wiki, there's a lot of great public stuff out there.
Yeah. There's a lot of great stuff on there, and there was a lot of interesting stuff in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings from officers who were on other ships in that battle group at the time. And one of them talks about how a common discussion in the wardroom of his cruiser was, quote, the problem with Vincennes.
Oh, jeez.
Vincennes was being really forward-leaning about everything in a situation where they weren't supposed to be stirring up the hornet's nest.
Interesting.
It is true that the Vincennes CIC team thought they were in combat. That is true.
Got it.
They were awake, so they thought they were in combat.
And one other little point I'd like to glom on to the, hey, you're the cap, or you were in command, you got to put on that smile and go to the party. Just in terms of being in command, one of the things I just wanted to throw in also, and this is something I tell new first officers and stuff like that. So when you're a first officer, you're in there, you're flying, you're just doing your job. You're not really thinking about that much. You just, run your procedures and do your job. But there's a significant difference when you're now sitting 4 feet to the left and you're the person signing for that airplane, and suddenly anytime there's a decision or weird situation, everyone's looking at you as to, hey, what decision are you going to make? It is a totally different, it's a huge shift. You're not just sitting a few feet to the left. It is a total shift in mentality that you have to take.
And if you read the writer's guide to the original series and you read Roddenberry's thoughts about Kirk, they got that. They very much got the fact that Kirk was kind of had nobody he could rely on. It was Kirk. He had Bones and Spock, and they also kind of represented the different halves of his personality as well. But at the end of the day, it was going to be his decision, and it was going to be he was going to have to live with himself.
And there's a very interesting. I was going to say there's a very interesting little scene that takes place in I don't even remember what episode it is. Data is in command of the Enterprise. Worf is functioning as the first officer, and Worf is making little comments, and Data basically says, "I need to see you in the ready room, first officer," and rips him a new one. And basically says, Worf's response is, Commander Riker always felt like he could talk to the captain, and it's like, yeah, that's true. If I'm asking you for your advice, you should give me your advice. But when I've made a decision, you never saw Riker undercut Picard in the way that you undercut me out there. And if you can't fly right and get on board with this, then I'll take you out of the first officer position and put you someplace, put you back on tactical. And then Data says, I hope I haven't ended our friendship. And Worf says, if anybody ended the friendship, it's mine. I would ask that can we just get beyond this? And I promise I'll fly right after this. And they did. The other thing I was going to say about this is there's a very interesting conversation that takes place in Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, right before Juan and Birdie and the assassin go off on their apprentice cruise. Colonel Nielsen, yes, that Nielsen. Colonel Nielsen is basically giving them some last minute advice. And one of the things he says is, like, what do? You could find yourself in a drop, and you could find that the 3 levels of command above you get knocked out, and you're in charge. What do you do then?
Hmm.
And one of the things he said, and this line has always stuck with me, is don't count on God to inspire you to give good orders. He'll be doing everything you can expect if you can keep the fear out of your voice.
In a crisis, you will not rise to the occasion. You will fall back on your best level of training.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah. So we're about at an hour. Can you guys go like 15 more minutes, or
Sure.
do you want to wrap? Yeah, we're good.
Good.
Okay. Because one of the things I really wanted to talk about, and this actually segues really nicely into it, is Star Trek's, is science fiction. There are all these incredible inventions like transporters and phasers and holodecks. But I've heard you all say that the real science fiction in Star Trek is management science, and how you have conscientious bosses and well-meaning employees and all that stuff. So I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about that. Whoever wants to go first, and about how the work environment of Starfleet is maybe a lot more emotionally intelligent than we're dealing with today.
I can jump on that grenade real quick. Yeah. I mean, it's very rare for me not to take the opportunity to talk, I guess. So one of the things that I've noticed about the various Starfleet officers we've seen, it's a little bit less true of the original series, but only a little. And if you throw Galileo 7 out, it mostly goes away. There isn't anybody we've ever seen wearing a Starfleet uniform that I wouldn't want to have on my team. And I'll ask the naval officers, the 3 naval officers we have in this conversation, like, wouldn't you just kill to have those guys in your department? I mean, there's not a one of them that isn't an A-list performer.
Even just 10%.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like most of them, frankly, I'd rather be their subordinate in many cases. Just because the level of technical and emotional competence often displayed is so high.
Yeah, you can. My friend Winchell Chung, the guy who put together the Atomic Rockets of the Space Patrol page, Winch summarizes this as the people on Star Trek only look like they're human.
Well,
it's fantastic.
Well, one thing I'd like to say, though, and someone else on this call can probably speak to it better than I can, but NASA has that philosophy of, hey, you're going to be stuck in this little soup can for days or weeks on end. You got to figure out how to get along.
Yes.
I don't know. Does that apply here?
But soup cans. Tell them about the Russian Space Agency's experiments with how long people can really, even if you pick the very best people, can do a good job being together.
Oh gosh.
Yeah,
it's
that's
been
what I
a
was
long
hoping.
time.
There is an incident where a Soviet cosmonaut told ground control that he was going to kill his coworker in the space station.
Yeah.
And ground control knew he wasn't joking.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so
all right. So
yeah.
My understanding is that the Russians did very serious experiments several decades ago about going to Mars. And they decided that they couldn't do it with the level of tech that they had at the time, not because they couldn't get a ship there, but because the crew, having to be in that small of a compartment, would kill each other before they arrived, because they'd done tests with mock-ups out without anybody else being allowed to go in and out, and they kept having to call them off because there were daily fist fights, and sometimes people were making shivs, and it just wasn't working.
Oh my gosh.
And this was with the cultural society around it, that these were the best of the best, and that the people in the compartments knew that they had family out there that could suffer from their bad choices. So there's as much pressure as you could possibly put on this group of people, and it still wasn't working.
Yeah, and I think I don't remember everything. It's been a while since I read those. I remember that now. I think the Air Force and NASA did studies back in the day. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a reason I work on advanced, when I got out of the Navy, I decided to get into the space industry, and I'm working on advanced propulsion systems. And the reason I'm working on advanced propulsion systems is kind of like, you want to go big or don't go, right? I mean, if you read, this is a great book, by the way. Thank you, Mr. Sternbach, Mr. Okuda. Thank you. Awesome book. The people who, certainly the Next Generation Technical Manual, but even just back in the day when Gene Roddenberry and Matt Jeffries were first doing the show, like they're out there in California. NASA and the Air Force and aerospace companies are all really huge in California. They would talk to folks and like, you know, the Enterprise isn't powered by matter and antimatter because Roddenberry picked it out of a hat. They talked to some people. In the intro to this book, Sternbach and Okuda thank prominent people in the advanced propulsion community because they talk to them, right? And people at Apple and other computer companies and aerospace companies and stuff. But and most of the time when people go to Tech Manual, they'll hit like the warp drive and the propulsion. But I invite you, go and read the crew chapter. There's like a whole page and a half. The writers at Trek, at least, knew, like these people are out there for a really long time. There's a reason the thing's the size of a city. They know you need space. There's a reason there's like all these trees on board. You know, in the original design for the Enterprise D, there's this enormous arboretum that we never saw in the middle of the primary hull because people just need to be able to go somewhere and chill and relax. And there's windows everywhere because astronauts love looking out at the stars. That's like I think it's true still. I think it's like the number one thing astronauts say that they do when they're not, you know, the 5 minutes of their day when they're not sleeping or doing really hard work. They're like in the cupola on the space station going, oh man, it's beautiful. And they're taking pictures and stuff, right? So I think Trek is they only hint at it because part of the science fiction really is management science, but it's fun to dream about like Riker has turned down command of a starship like 15 times over the course of a series. In the United States Navy, if I turned down command once, I'd have been done. That would have been it. Well, that person doesn't have enough confidence. He's gone. But in Star Trek, they're like, no, that person's growing. He's growing in self-awareness. We got time. He needs a little bit more time in the oven. Send him back to Picard, right? And I think, I don't know. I'm not really saying. The only thing I want to say is like it's one of the things I love about Star Trek is it's awesome to like look at their vision of the future and go, how do we get there? Because it's so tantalizing. They just suggest it with these little hints, and then you're like, well, maybe we could do that, right? I mean, that's what got me into the industry. It's Trek.
So if I can riff for just a second about if we can do a little sidebar about the Tech Manual, because yes. I'd love to just, I mean, I'll tag on to what Andy said about. I'd like to publicly thank Mike Okuda and Rick Sternbach for the Tech Manual. The Tech Manual is just fantastic, and I mean, it's really the exemplar. Like a lot of science fiction fans, I've got an entire shelf full of things that say Tech Manual on them, and it's one of the two that really stand out. The other one is the Aliens Colonial Marines Technical Manual, and it's cool, but I don't think it's as good as the Next Gen Tech Manual is. And in part, it's because, you know, Sternbach and Okuda have really thought through all the technology involved, and they based it on real world science, and they can do the math on a bunch of this stuff, and there's some really cool stuff there. It's also because they understand that the technical manual, technology isn't necessarily something that I can hold in my hand. I mean, it is, but there's a management aspect to technology as well, right? Developing good doctrine is technology. I've actually designed a game about developing technology, and we include doctrine as one of the things that you need to do in order to make your technology work right. And it's one of the things. So I didn't talk neither Pat or I mentioned it in the intro, but Pat and I actually do a show on YouTube called Starfleet Tactical, where we bring our expertise, and sometimes we have guests, but frequently it's just us talking about various topics involving science fiction and the real world, the intersection of those two things. And I spend a lot of time talking about doctrine on that show, and how important doctrine is, and how, you know, you need to have that sort of stuff. You need to have standard operating procedures. And, you know, some people go that, you know, that's boring, but it's not. It's the enabling factor. And I love watching episodes of Star Trek where I'm trying to sort of piece together. It's like, it's clear. You never have to say, target the shields or something like that, right? When they're doing fleet actions, they know how to use their gear. It's clear that they know they may do pass targeting priorities to each other, you know, well, like when Picard tells them in the one movie on the Borg cube, you know, target this. We think that's like that's the head or a trash compactor or something. No, trust me, target. So there's some stuff like that where they're passing targeting information, but in general, you know, they know how to use their gear. But that sort of doctrine stuff is really important. And one of the things I love about the Next Gen Tech Manual is, like, when Picard says go to red alert, that isn't just push the button. When the button gets pushed, there's a bunch of automated procedures that take place. People start doing things all throughout the ship. And that book talks about some of the things that are automatically done, like what level of diagnostics are done on the computers. And, you know, they bring extra generators up to speed. I remember seeing that watching underway replenishments. I spent a lot of, whenever I'd go to sea with the Navy, I spent a lot of time watching underway replenishments. And, you know, when they say the restricted maneuvering doctrine is in effect, about 20 seconds later, you start seeing smoke coming out of the smokestacks on the DDG because they've just lit off 2 more turbines, because doctrine says that when restricted maneuvering is in effect, you have to have all 4 of your turbine generators online. And that's because you're going to get really close to another ship. And when you do that, you could go bump. And so you want to have as much power available as fast as possible if you need to maneuver.
Yeah, and I think that doctrine is something a lot of people who are just getting into science fiction, maybe, you know, writing fan fiction and stuff like that, that's the kind of layer that you don't necessarily think about too much, in terms of these are the rules and procedures that have been distilled over essentially centuries or decades of experience. And we talked about that with the bell knot pull, right? Like that is doctrine. When you when you're not in flight operations, you raise your bell nut pole because this terrible thing happened, and now we have a reaction to solve. We're solving the problem, and layering that stuff into your stories rounds out your universe and shows the evolution and shows the kind of legacy and inherited history of what your character is, the world they're living in. So we're really running out of time, and we could go down an hour on any one of these topics. Andy has a really cool story though that I think this audience would love to hear. So I'm going to throw it to you to wrap it up before we say our goodbyes and tell everybody where they can find us. But yeah, tell us about the Enterprise, Andy.
Okay, so back in late 2000, early 2001. I was an officer on a submarine in San Diego, and the public affairs officer, for reasons I can't remember, knew I was a big Star Trek fan. And she called me and my buddy one day and called the captain and said, "Hey, look, we've got some people from Hollywood. They're working on the next Star Trek series, and they want to tour a submarine." And so I went, "Oh, okay. I'm probably going to meet some guys from the art department. That'll be cool." And and the captain says, "Presby, you want to do this?" And I was like, "Sure. I'm on duty that day anyway, sir. It'll be fun." And so my buddy and I, we show up, and it's Herman Zimmerman, Rick Berman, and Brannon Braga, I think. Yeah, I'm pretty sure the third person was Brannon Braga. And they were in pre-production on Star Trek Enterprise. And especially Mr. Zimmerman, they wanted details. Like, we spent 2.5, 3 hours going through every part of a Los Angeles class fast attack submarine you can show somebody without a clearance, which is a surprisingly large amount, right? And we showed them our staterooms and the crew's bunk rooms and the mess decks where you eat the food, and the kitchen, and the torpedo room. We showed them. We spent a lot of time in the torpedo room, and a lot of time in control. What we call the bridge on a submarine is up in the part that sticks out of the water. It's up in the conning tower. We call that the bridge. The control room is down inside the hull. It's where the ship is actually steered from. And it was a lot of fun, a lot of great discussions and things. And it was weird watching Enterprise. Like, the bridge railings on the NX-01 look like the industrial pipe we had as our control railings, as the railings on the con of the Houston. And just little details like that. I got to see how his artist's eye sort of picked it out and put it in different places. And that was a lot of fun. That was really cool.
So now tell them the rest of the story.
Uh-oh.
Oh, the part where later when Enterprise,
you visited them.
Yeah, when Enterprise was out of pre-production and in production for the first season, they invited us down.
Oh, awesome.
So I don't think I have posted the pictures anywhere where anybody can see them. They're really old, nasty, grainy, bad digital camera photos. But like, I've got photos of me in my dress uniform sitting in the captain's chair. Note to self, I'm short. The captain of Archer, actor, love the guy. What's his name?
Scott Bakula.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott Bakula. Much taller than me.
Perhaps the chair
You'd
was
almost have
designed
to
for
be.
him and not for you.
Yeah, definitely. We got to see the whole set. We got to see sick bay. I think they were filming the episode that was in Pajem, the Vulcan monastery turned spy facility. And so, yeah, it was really cool to see all the little details and stuff. I've got a picture of me in front of the warp core going like, and so here I am.
And there's one last thing you forgot, Andy.
What did I forget?
The re-enlistment photos that I've seen.
That's that. Yeah, I did get to re-enlist one of my sailors on the bridge of the NX-01.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
When you join the Navy, you enlist. If you decide to stay on past that time, you re-enlist. And usually, as long as you're not like in active war, you can have some choice about where you might get to do that. But usually your choices do not include Hollywood sets.
Normally you can't do that, but yeah. So that was a lot of fun.
And you also get to choose the officer who does the
Yeah,
swearing.
right. So he picked me, which was very nice of him.
That's really cool. All right. Well, I think we gotta call it. But this was a tremendous amount of fun, like I knew it would be. I hope everybody in the audience enjoyed. Thank you so much. We had a great crowd turned out tonight, and so as Chris, you like to say, if there are any saved rounds anybody wants to mention really quick, we'll pass it around. We'll start with you, Patrick.
Well, just one other thing to think about also is that, in season 5 or 6 of Next Gen, we see them actually doing like personnel evaluation. There's a lot of this sort of everyday housekeeping stuff that goes on. And so it was cool to see that they did that. And the other thing to think about is in the real Navy, you don't get to just camp out at your job. Right? You don't get to find the job you like and just stay there. If you're the captain of a ship, you get to do it for 2 years and you're out. You're moving on, whether it's an up or out kind of thing. Starfleet, so think about the implications. Starfleet is this organization where you can stay where you want. So how many command opportunities actually come up? Considering that some captains sit there for 10, 15 years or something like that. So anyways, it's a different aspect. There's no time to go deep into it, but it's kind of interesting. And how do you maintain people's career progressions and stuff like that when people can just say, yep, I like being a lieutenant. I'm just going to stay here at this job. Anyways.
well, really quick, do you want to plug your game?
Yeah. So we've got a little company called Mariner Games. made a Starship combat game called Star Force Commander. Obviously, I've taken what I've learned throughout science fiction, tried to incorporate a lot of those decision points. The key thing is there's lots of decisions. You're allocating power, figuring out weapons, managing your shields and your power and stuff like that. So you have a lot of decisions to make. And the big thing there is that everything you do has a tactical trade-off. Any choice you make comes at the expense of not being able to do something else. And so it's a lot of fun. We'll have it at Marcon, and a friend of mine was just showing it at another small game convention recently. So it's been a lot of fun. And it's available on Wargame Vault.
And I'm gonna pump up Patrick's cred here a little bit. I'm gonna toot his horn a little bit more. Pat's not just some guy who decided that he was going to do a game. He's the author of the Federation Commander Tactics Manual. And do I remember correctly? You're like a Federation Commander national champion?
4 times. Now that you mention it, yeah.
So I mean, this is a guy who has spent a lot of time thinking about how to game science fiction combat that has sort of a Star Trek look and feel about it. This isn't just, Bob decided that he was going to publish a game. Patrick's been doing this forever, and he's really, really good at it.
Thank you.
Awesome.
So,
well, Chris,
and he's also shy and lets me do all the talking.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can go next, Chris. But we always said that Chris was our designated extrovert.
Yes, that was my role in BU 9. I was the designated extrovert, arguably the only one in that group. So I got 2 things to say. First of all, I showed up wearing a red shirt and looked around and went, "Oh shit, I'm Ensign Ricky." Apparently, I survived to the very end of this, so thank you very much. We should probably get off the stage as quickly as possible while that statement is true. The second thing is, let me just repeat that Pat and I have a show that runs approximately every Saturday night. It's not running this Saturday because I'm going to be at a science fiction convention, but it's at 10 p.m. Eastern time. Just do a search on YouTube for Starfleet Tactical. The next episode's going to be episode 91, and it should be next weekend. So, I mean, this is something that started off during COVID. I got invited to sort of go on somebody else's show, and then I got invited back, and then it's like I know a guy, and Pat showed up. And so then next thing I know, Pat and I, the show's been retitled Starfleet Tactical, and Pat and I are doing it. And so we've been doing it for 2 years now, and don't really have any plans to go away anytime soon. So if you want to hear about, I did an episode where I talked about how the development of the U.S. Navy battleship tactics in the interwar period, why that's relevant for science fiction.
And I did an episode there where we talked about the Akira and all the torpedo launchers and stuff too. So we talk about both real and sci-fi. All right.
And if you understand what Chris just said, you'll probably find it interesting.
And we're talking about doing a meetup at the Marcon Science Fiction Convention in next Memorial Day. We're going to try to sort of pull in all the BU 9, as many of the BU 9 colleagues that I can get to come to this. And try to pull in as many Starfleet Tactical watchers as we can. So come and join us in lovely Columbus, Ohio, next Memorial Day weekend.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And then Presbys, why don't you take us home?
All right. Thank you so much for having us here. Do want to remind people I do have a book that you might enjoy reading, a hard science fiction novel about building Earth's first space elevator in Africa, The Dabere Snake Launcher. And you can get it Barnes & Noble, Amazon, wherever.
And you probably won't, I don't have a YouTube channel. I don't make any games. I help her research her books.
He designed spacecraft for me. This is a very important job.
This is my fun and also my function. And look to the sky, because I work with and for people who are trying to make that real.
Yeah.
So
awesome.
Andy has written a
that's
technical article about the background of my novel that's going to be available on Bain.com either
Next month.
mid-October or mid-November.
Yeah.
But if you go to my website and sign up for my newsletter, as soon as I know when it's available, you will know.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank all of you. I love you all so much. We've been great friends for so many years, and it's been great to get together and shoot the ship, as I like to say. I want to thank everybody who showed up tonight. We had a great crowd. I want to thank Mike Fadum, Ambassador Kale, for doing tech for us. Thank you so much for doing this on a weeknight. I really, really appreciate it. And finally, I want to say that if you remember, there was a name drop of Rick Sternbach. Rick Sternbach co-wrote a couple Star Trek tech manuals and obviously was an illustrator on Voyager, DS9, a bunch of Star Trek shows and movies. And he is actually going to be a part of Fleet Week. He's going to be on our 12 p.m. panel on Saturday, October 15th, Admiralty Day. And that'll be hosted by my good friend Amy Imhoff, and she's going to do a great job with that, the science behind Starships. So if you want to hear Rick from his own mouth, tune in for that. It's going to be a great day. Just if you really enjoy this panel, it's just going to be a lot more of that, I think. So I'm really excited about that. I really, it's been great seeing all the community streams that happened this week so far already. And we'll see more coming up in the next few days. I'll actually be on a couple coming up. I'll be on Q Continuum stream on Friday, and then I'll be on Piece by Pieces stream. I believe that's going to be on Thursday, and those are all on our little one sheet about all the community events. So I will see you out there that away. Thanks, everybody, and have a great night.